December 7th, 1942. Paris shivered under a blanket of early winter frost, its streets nearly empty as evening approached. The grand boulevards, once teeming with life and laughter, now stood as hollow reminders of what the City of Light had been before the occupation. On this particular evening, Captain Robert Beaumont of the American Office of Strategic Services walked briskly along the Seine, the collar of his civilian coat turned up against the biting cold, unaware that his simple act of kindness would soon entangle him in one of the war's most intricate webs of deception. He believed he was merely meeting a contact to exchange information about supply routes. In reality, he was walking directly into a trap that would test not only his training but his fundamental understanding of humanity during wartime. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how a spontaneous gesture of compassion would lead to a dangerous game of cat and mouse between an American intelligence officer and a German operative, ultimately revealing how the boundaries between enemy and ally could blur in unexpected ways when faced with the cold reality of survival. The winter of 1942 had been particularly cruel to Paris. Fuel shortages meant that most buildings remained unheated, and food was scarce. Parisians had grown accustomed to the rumble in their stomachs, the perpetual chill in their bones, and the constant presence of German soldiers patrolling the streets. For those who had remained in the occupied capital, daily life had become an exercise in caution and restraint. Captain Robert Beaumont had arrived in Paris 3 months earlier, under the cover of being a Swiss journalist writing about European art preservation efforts during the conflict. His actual mission was to establish contact with resistance networks and gather intelligence on German troop movements and supply chains. At 42 years old, Beaumont was older than most field operatives, but his background as an art historian and his fluency in French, German and Italian made him invaluable to the OSS. "Your coffee, monsieur," said the waiter at Café Madeleine, placing a small cup before Beaumont. The liquid was dark but thin, mostly chicory with perhaps a hint of actual coffee beans. "Thank you, Marcel," Beaumont replied, noting the small folded paper beneath the saucer, his first communication of the day from the network. He would read it later, somewhere private. For now, he sipped the bitter substitute and observed the other patrons, always alert for the telltale signs of surveillance. Across town, in a modest apartment on Rue Saint-Dominique, Elise Durand, born Margaret Hoffman, prepared for her evening assignment. She stood before a mirror, applying a light shade of lipstick, the only cosmetic luxury she allowed herself these days. At 31 years old, Elise had been operating in Paris for 18 months as part of the Abwehr's intelligence network. Her cover as the widow of a French officer who had died during the fall of France had served her well, allowing her to move through Parisian society with relative freedom. "You understand your objective tonight?" asked Major Klaus Weber, her handler, who sat in an armchair by the window watching the street below. "Of course," Elise replied, switching from French to German. "Identify the American agents' contacts within the museum network. We believe they are using art preservation as a cover for communications." Weber nodded, his thin face expressionless. "The Führer, the leadership believes the Americans are planning something significant. Their increased activity in Paris suggests they are gathering intelligence for a future operation." Elise nodded, careful to show neither too much enthusiasm nor any reluctance. After 18 months in the field, she had learned that survival depended on maintaining a delicate balance, being useful enough to justify her continued deployment, but not so exceptional as to attract undue attention from either side. "I should go," she said, glancing at her watch. "I need to make an appearance at the gallery opening before heading to the target location." Weber stood. "Remember, Fräulein Hoffmann, Paris may seem to be accepting its fate, but resistance is everywhere. Trust no one." Elise offered a thin smile. "I never do, Major." As she left the apartment, Elise felt the familiar weight of her pistol in her handbag. She had used it only once before, and hoped never to do so again. Her strength was in information gathering, in charm and manipulation, not in violence. Yet in occupied Paris, violence was always a possibility that one had to be prepared for. By 6 o'clock that evening, Robert Beaumont had deciphered the message from his contact. It directed him to meet at 7:30 near Notre Dame Cathedral with someone who claimed to have information about German plans to move artwork from the Louvre to Germany. The message had come through a trusted channel, but something about its urgency made Beaumont uneasy. Nevertheless, duty called. After finishing a meagre dinner of bread and thin soup at his boarding house, Beaumont set out toward the meeting point. The night had grown colder, and a light snow had begun to fall, dusting the shoulders of his wool coat as he walked. The beauty of Paris in the snow momentarily distracted him from the tension of his mission, the white flakes softening the edges of a city under strain, covering the scars of occupation, if only temporarily. As he approached the Pont de l'Archevêché, the small bridge near Notre Dame, Beaumont observed a woman standing alone, looking out over the dark waters of the Seine. She wore a thin coat that seemed inadequate against the December cold, and she was visibly shivering. His contact was not due for another 15 minutes, and something about the solitary figure triggered both his compassion and his caution. He approached slowly, making his footsteps audible so as not to startle her. "Pardonnez-moi, madame," he said in his flawless French. "Are you all right? It's quite cold to be standing here alone." The woman turned, and Beaumont was struck by the elegant structure of her face. High cheekbones, clear blue eyes, and a composed expression that seemed to be fighting against the cold. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied, her voice carrying just the slightest hint of an accent he couldn't immediately place. "Just enjoying the view." "The Seine is beautiful tonight," Beaumont agreed, maintaining a respectful distance, "but perhaps not worth catching pneumonia over." A small smile touched her lips. "Perhaps you're right, but my appointment is nearby and I arrived early." Beaumont noted the coincidence, but didn't remark on it. Instead, seeing her shiver again, he made a decision that was partly genuine kindness and partly a cover. A normal man would offer his coat to a woman obviously cold. To do otherwise might seem suspicious. "Please," he said, already removing his coat. "Take this. I have another layer beneath, and you look thoroughly chilled." She began to protest, but another violent shiver betrayed her. "That's very kind, but I couldn't possibly—" "I insist," Beaumont said, draping the coat over her shoulders. "Consider it a small act of civility in uncivil times." For a moment, genuine surprise registered in her eyes. "Thank you, monsieur." "Benoit," he offered, using his cover name. "Robert Benoit." "Elise Durand," she replied, pulling the warm coat tighter around herself. "Your kindness is unexpected but very welcome." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the snow fall onto the dark river below. Beaumont was calculating the probability that this was a coincidence versus the possibility of a trap. His training urged caution, but nothing about the woman's behavior suggested she was anything other than what she appeared, a Parisian caught unprepared for the evening chill. "Do you live nearby, Monsieur Benoit?" she asked, breaking the silence. "Not far," he replied vaguely. "I'm staying near Montparnasse, and you?" "Saint-Germain-des-Prés," she said, equally vague, "though I grew up in Alsace." That explained the slight accent, Beaumont thought. The border region had its own distinctive lilt, influenced by both French and German. "I should go," Elise said suddenly, glancing at her watch. "My appointment. But your coat—" "Keep it for now," Beaumont said. "Perhaps we could meet tomorrow so you can return it. Say, Café Madeleine at 3. The suggestion was spontaneous but calculated. If she was innocent, it was merely a kindness. If she was connected to his mission in any way, it might provide useful information. Elise hesitated, then nodded. "Café Madeleine at 3. Thank you again, Monsieur Benoit." As she walked away, disappearing into the light snowfall, Beaumont checked his watch. 7:25. His contact would arrive any minute. He positioned himself where he could observe all approaches to the meeting point, his senses heightened by the encounter with the mysterious Elise. What Beaumont didn't know, couldn't know, was that Elise Durand had just reported his presence via a brief encounter with another pedestrian who passed her on the bridge. Her assignment that night had been to confirm the identity of an American agent believed to be operating near Notre Dame. The coat now wrapped around her shoulders contained something even more valuable than warmth. The inner pocket held a notebook with Beaumont's latest intelligence notes, which he had forgotten in his moment of chivalry. When Beaumont's actual contact, an elderly man who worked as a janitor at the Louvre, arrived 5 minutes later, they exchanged only a few sentences before the Frenchman handed over a small package wrapped in brown paper. "The inventory you requested," the man said quietly. "And a warning. There have been arrests among the museum staff. Someone is talking." Beaumont thanked him and tucked the package inside his jacket, feeling the absence of his coat more keenly now that the snow was falling more heavily. His mind returned to Elise Durand. There had been something in her eyes, a sharpness, an intelligence that seemed at odds with her vulnerable appearance on the bridge. But perhaps that was simply the effect of living under occupation, where everyone developed keen instincts for survival. Later that night, in her apartment, Elise carefully examined the contents of Beaumont's notebook. Most of the entries were in a simple substitution cipher that the Abwehr had already broken. The notes revealed that the Americans were tracking German art requisitions, apparently trying to establish a pattern that might indicate future military operations. "This is excellent work," Major Weber said, flipping through the pages. "How did you obtain it?" Elise explained the bridge encounter, presenting it as a calculated operation rather than the chance meeting it had actually been. "He believes I'm just a woman he helped. We're meeting tomorrow so I can return his coat." Weber's eyes gleamed. "Perfect. This gives us an opportunity to feed him false information. We'll prepare the appropriate materials tonight." When Elise was finally alone, she sat on the edge of her bed, remembering the genuine concern in the American's eyes when he'd offered his coat. Such small kindnesses had become rare in occupied Paris, where survival often trumped compassion. For a brief moment she allowed herself to feel a twinge of guilt about exploiting the gesture. But war was war, and she had her duty, just as Beaumont had his. Tomorrow at Café Madeleine the real game would begin. The next day dawned grey and even colder. Beaumont had spent a restless night, troubled by the warning about informants among the museum staff, and berating himself for the carelessness of leaving his notebook in his coat. The notes were encoded, but a skilled cryptographer could potentially break the simple cipher. He would have to assume the worst and alert his handler that the information might be compromised. At precisely 3 o'clock, Beaumont entered Café Madeleine, scanning the room before taking a seat with his back to the wall, and a clear view of both the entrance and the rear exit. 5 minutes later, Elise arrived, wearing his coat and carrying a small package. She spotted him immediately and approached with a warm smile. "Monsieur Benoit, thank you again for your kindness last night. I've brought your coat and a small token of appreciation." She placed the package on the table as she removed his coat and handed it back. "You didn't need to bring anything," Beaumont said, accepting both the coat and the package with a gracious nod. "Just some pastries from my neighborhood bakery," Elise explained. "A rare luxury these days, but the baker is an old family friend." Beaumont thanked her and ordered coffee for them both, the same weak, chicory-heavy substitute that passed for coffee in occupied Paris. As they sipped the warm liquid, they engaged in careful conversation, each probing for information while revealing little. "You mentioned you're from Alsace," Beaumont said. "That must be difficult, with the region now under direct German control." A shadow crossed Elise's face. "Yes, my parents still live there. Communication is restricted." "I'm sorry to hear that," Beaumont said, noting the genuine emotion that flickered across her features. "This war has separated too many families. And what brings a Swiss journalist to Paris in these troubled times?" Elise asked, smoothly changing the subject. "There must be safer places to write about art." Beaumont gave her the cover story he had rehearsed countless times. "I'm documenting the preservation efforts. Despite the circumstances, there are dedicated people working to protect Europe's cultural heritage. I find their stories compelling." "Noble work," Elise commented, "though I imagine it brings you into contact with both the occupation authorities and those who resist them." "I try to remain neutral," Beaumont replied with a slight smile. "Switzerland has a long tradition of neutrality. After all." Their conversation continued in this vein, a delicate dance of probing questions and carefully crafted responses. To any observer, they would have appeared to be nothing more than two acquaintances enjoying a brief respite from the hardships of occupation. But beneath the pleasant exchange, both were gathering information, assessing weaknesses, and planning their next moves. As they parted an hour later, Beaumont felt increasingly certain that Elise Durand was more than she appeared. The precision of her questions, the careful way she avoided certain topics, and something indefinable in her manner all triggered his trained instincts. Yet he couldn't dismiss the genuine warmth that occasionally broke through her composed exterior. "Perhaps we'll meet again." "Monsieur Benoit," Elise said as she prepared to leave. "I would like that," Beaumont replied honestly. "Paris can be a lonely city these days." That evening, when Beaumont unwrapped the package of pastries in the privacy of his room, he discovered a folded note tucked among them. The message was brief and startling. "The museum network is compromised. 3 arrests yesterday. Proceed with caution." The note was unsigned and the handwriting unfamiliar. If genuine, this was valuable intelligence, confirming what his Louvre contact had warned about. But it could also be a trap, designed to make him reveal his connections by how he responded. Beaumont carefully burned the note and considered his options. The coincidence of meeting Elise just before his arranged contact, her appearance at the exact location, and now this warning, it stretched credibility. Yet if she were a German agent, why warn him about the compromised network? The next week brought a series of encounters between Beaumont and Elise, seemingly chance meetings that both knew were carefully orchestrated. They met at art galleries, in bookshops, and once in the gardens of the Luxembourg Palace, where the winter flowers struggled beneath a thin layer of frost. Each time they exchanged pleasantries, subtle information, and cautious assessments of each other's true nature. For Beaumont, these meetings served a dual purpose: to determine Elise's actual allegiance and to feed controlled information through her to whoever she might be reporting to. He had informed his OSS handler about the situation, and they had devised a strategy to use the connection to their advantage. What Beaumont didn't anticipate was the genuine connection that began to form between them. Despite the layers of deception, there were moments of authentic conversation. Discussions about books they had both read, memories of Paris before the war, and philosophical debates about art and its purpose in times of conflict. During one such conversation at a small bookshop on Rue de Seine, Elise had picked up a volume of poetry by Paul Éluard, whose works were technically banned due to his resistance activities. "Dangerous reading," Beaumont commented quietly. "Beauty is always dangerous," Elise replied, replacing the book on the shelf. "It makes us want things we cannot have." There was something in her voice, a wistfulness perhaps, or a carefully concealed regret, that made Beaumont wonder what she might have been in another life, one not shaped by war and espionage. For Elise, the assignment was becoming increasingly complicated. Major Weber was pleased with the intelligence she was gathering from Beaumont, unaware that much of it was deliberately misleading. The American was clearly feeding her information designed to waste German resources and attention. What troubled her more was the growing realization that she looked forward to their meetings, finding in Beaumont's company a respite from the constant performance that her role required. On January 10, 1943, everything changed. Elise received word that 3 members of her Abwehr network had been arrested by the Gestapo on suspicion of embezzling confiscated Jewish property. The line between different German intelligence agencies had always been blurred and competitive, but this development put her in immediate danger. If her colleagues broke under interrogation, her cover could be compromised. That same evening, Beaumont received intelligence that the Germans were planning to move a significant collection of artwork from the Louvre to Berlin, not just as cultural plunder, but to hide documentation that had been concealed within the frames of certain paintings by resistance members. Their scheduled meeting the next day at Café Madeleine took on a new urgency for both of them, though neither knew of the other's crisis. When Elise arrived 15 minutes late and visibly tense, Beaumont immediately sensed something was wrong. "Are you all right?" he asked as she sat down, her hands trembling slightly as she removed her gloves. "Just the cold," she replied, attempting a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Winter seems endless this year." They ordered their usual coffee, but the familiar routine felt strained. After several minutes of superficial conversation, Elise leaned forward. "Robert," she said, using his first name for the first time, "if you needed to leave Paris quickly, how would you do it?" The question confirmed Beaumont's suspicions that she was involved in something beyond ordinary civilian life. "That depends on why I was leaving," he replied carefully, "and who might be looking for me." Their eyes met, and in that moment something shifted between them, a tacit acknowledgement of the game they had been playing and the real dangers that surrounded them. "I may have stayed too long at the party," Elise said quietly, the metaphor clear, "and I find myself without an escort home." Beaumont considered his options. If Elise was indeed a German agent, she could be setting an elaborate trap. But his instincts, honed through years of intelligence work, told him her fear was genuine. Something had spooked her, and she was reaching out to him, either as a fellow human being in danger or as a potential escape route. "There's a bookshop on Rue Saint-Jacques," he said finally. "The owner sometimes helps people find rare editions that aren't available in Paris. Be there at 8 tonight. Bring only what you can carry inconspicuously." Relief flickered across Elise's face, followed immediately by caution. "Why would you help me?" "Perhaps for the same reason you warned me about the museum network," Beaumont replied. "Some kindnesses transcend our official allegiances." They parted ways shortly after, each aware that they had crossed a line from which there was no easy return. For Beaumont, the decision to offer Elise an escape route was partly strategic. If she was indeed an Abwehr agent, turning her could provide valuable intelligence. But he acknowledged to himself that there was more to it, a recognition of the person beneath the role she played, whoever that might truly be. For Elise, the decision to meet Beaumont that night represented the culmination of months of growing disillusionment. She had joined the Abwehr believing in her duty to her country, but her time in Paris had shown her the reality of occupation, the casual cruelty, the hunger, the fear that permeated every aspect of life. The recent arrests within her network were just the final confirmation that in the world of espionage everyone was ultimately expendable. At 7:30 that evening, as Elise was preparing to leave for the meeting with Beaumont, there was a sharp knock at her apartment door. Her hand went instinctively to the pistol hidden in her coat pocket as she approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" she called. "Major Weber," came the reply. "Open up, Fräulein Hoffmann. We have urgent matters to discuss." Elise's heart sank, but her training took over. She tucked the pistol out of sight, composed her features, and opened the door to admit her handler. Weber entered briskly, his coat dusted with snow, his expression grim. "We have a problem," he said without preamble. "Schneider talked before they executed him. The Gestapo now has a description of an Abwehr agent matching your appearance." Elise maintained her composure with effort. "What are my orders?" "You're being recalled to Berlin immediately," Weber said. "A car will come for you at 9. Be ready." After Weber left, Elise stood motionless in the center of her apartment, weighing her options. Return to Berlin, where she would likely face suspicion and possibly charges of incompetence at best, treason at worst. Or meet Beaumont and take her chances with the Americans, who might simply arrest her as an enemy agent. At precisely 8 o'clock, the bell above the door of Librairie Ancienne on Rue Saint-Jacques tinkled as Elise entered. The shop was dimly lit and apparently empty of customers. An elderly man looked up from behind the counter, studied her face for a moment, then silently gestured toward a door at the back of the shop. Elise found Beaumont waiting in a small office lined with leather-bound volumes. He was not alone. A stern-faced man in his 50s sat behind the desk, evaluating her with cold, professional assessment. "This is Monsieur Fournier," Beaumont said simply. "He has questions before we can proceed." What followed was an intense interrogation, conducted in whispers, but no less thorough for its quiet tone. Elise answered truthfully about her recruitment, her assignments in Paris, the information she had passed to the Germans, including what she had learned from Beaumont. She omitted only her growing doubts about her mission and her personal feelings toward the American agent. When Fournier finally seemed satisfied, he nodded to Beaumont and left the room, presumably to make arrangements. "Why did you come?" Beaumont asked when they were alone. "You must have known this was a risk." Elise met his gaze steadily. The Gestapo arrested members of my network. I was to be recalled to Berlin tonight. Neither option offered much hope of survival. And now you're placing your life in the hands of your enemies, Beaumont observed. Are you my enemy, Robert? Elise asked softly. You offered me your coat that night on the bridge. An enemy would have let me shiver. A ghost of a smile touched Beaumont's lips. Perhaps we're both more than the roles we've been assigned in this conflict. Fournier returned 20 minutes later with new identity papers for Elise and instructions for their journey. They would leave Paris separately and rendezvous in Lyon, where resistance networks were stronger and escape routes to Switzerland more established. As they prepared to part ways at the bookshop, Elise hesitated. I took something from your coat that night, your notebook. I should have told you sooner. Beaumont's expression remained unreadable. I know. The information was deliberately flawed. We suspected someone was getting too close to our operation. Not all of it was false, Elise countered. The network at the Jeu de Paume, you saved them with your warning. Just as you warned me about the museum arrests, Beaumont acknowledged. It seems we've been playing a more complex game than either of our superiors realized. Their journey south was fraught with danger. Checkpoints had been increased following a series of resistance attacks, and German patrols were stopping trains and checking papers with renewed vigilance. They traveled separately, but paralleled each other's routes, occasionally catching glimpses across train platforms or in station cafes, never acknowledging each other, but drawing reassurance from the other's continued progress. In Lyon, they reunited at a safe house operated by members of the resistance, people who viewed Elise with undisguised suspicion, but accepted Beaumont's assurances that she had valuable intelligence to offer. During the 2 weeks they spent waiting for the right opportunity to cross into Switzerland, Beaumont and Elise had time to learn each other's true stories, not the carefully constructed covers or the professional half-truths, but the actual paths that had led them to that cold December night on a Paris bridge. Elise spoke of her childhood in Hamburg, not Alsace, of her recruitment into the Abwehr after university, of her initial patriotic fervor that had slowly been eroded by the realities of occupation. Beaumont shared his background as an art historian who had been recruited by the OSS specifically because of his knowledge of European museums and cultural institutions. I keep thinking about that moment on the bridge, Elise said one evening as they sat in the small attic room that had become their temporary refuge. Such a simple thing, offering a coat to someone cold. Yet it changed everything. Small gestures reveal character, Beaumont replied, even in war, perhaps especially in war. On February 2nd, 1943, they finally received word that their crossing could proceed. A guide would take them through mountain paths to the Swiss border, avoiding German patrols that monitored the more obvious routes. The night before their departure, Elise found Beaumont standing alone by the window of their safe house, looking out at the lights of Lyon. Having second thoughts? She asked quietly. He turned to her with a wry smile. About escorting a German intelligence officer to safety. My superiors certainly are, but they value the information you're bringing enough to overlook your previous allegiance. And you? What do you value, Robert? The question hung between them, laden with all the complexities of their situation, enemy agents who had become unlikely allies, perhaps something more. I value the person who warned me about the museum arrests, he said finally. The one who chose to meet me at the bookshop rather than return to Berlin. The woman who shivered on a bridge and accepted a stranger's coat. Their journey through the mountains was arduous, made more difficult by heavy snow and the constant threat of discovery. Their guide, a taciturn man who had been smuggling people across the border since the fall of France, set a punishing pace. By the second day, even Beaumont, who prided himself on his physical conditioning, was struggling to keep up. Elise, despite her exhaustion, maintained a quiet determination that impressed both men. When they stopped to rest in an abandoned shepherd's hut high in the mountains, she was the one who organized their meager supplies and insisted on taking her turn at watch. Your German agent has courage, the guide commented to Beaumont in French, apparently assuming Elise wouldn't understand. She is not my German agent, Beaumont replied in the same language. And yes, she does. Elise, pretending not to have heard, allowed herself a small, private smile. On the morning of the third day, as they approached the Swiss border, they spotted a German patrol in the valley below. Their guide signaled for absolute silence as they crouched behind a rocky outcropping, watching the soldiers move methodically through the snow. "They're searching for someone," the guide whispered. "We must wait until they move on." Hours passed in tense silence, the temperature dropping as the sun began to set. Elise, wedged between Beaumont and a large boulder, felt the cold seeping into her bones despite her layers of clothing. Beside her, Beaumont noticed her shivering. Without a word, he removed his outer coat, the same one he had offered her that night in Paris, and draped it over both of them, creating a small pocket of shared warmth. The gesture, so similar to their first meeting yet now fraught with new meaning, brought unexpected tears to Elise's eyes. "We've come full circle," she whispered, so softly that only he could hear. "Not quite," Beaumont replied. "The circle will close when we reach safety." When darkness fell, the patrol finally moved on and their guide led them through the final stretch toward the border. They crossed into Switzerland just before midnight, the only marker of their transition to neutral territory being a small border stone half buried in snow. Their guide left them at a farmhouse a mile inside Swiss territory, where they were met by OSS contacts who would escort them to Bern. Before departing, the guide shook their hands and offered a rare smile. "Good luck," he said. "Perhaps when this is all over you can return to Paris together and walk along the Seine in peacetime." The idea seemed so distant, so improbable, that neither Beaumont nor Elise knew how to respond. But as they watched the guide disappear back into the darkness, heading for the border and the dangers beyond, the possibility of a future after the war suddenly seemed more tangible than it had in years. In Bern, Elise spent weeks being debriefed by Allied intelligence officers, sharing everything she knew about Abwehr operations, German troop deployments, and the command structure in occupied Paris. Beaumont was present for some of these sessions, but was soon recalled to London to report directly to OSS headquarters. Before he left, he sought out Elise in the small room she had been assigned in a safe house on the outskirts of the city. "I'm leaving tomorrow," he said without preamble. "New assignment." Elise nodded, unsurprised. The machinery of war ground on, regardless of personal connections formed in its midst. "Will you return to Paris?" "Eventually," Beaumont replied. "There's still work to be done there. And you? What happens now?" "Your people have suggested I might be useful in counterintelligence," Elise said with a slight shrug. "Apparently, my accent is convincing enough to pass as a French refugee in radio broadcasts back to the occupied territories." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, both aware that this might be their last meeting for some time, perhaps forever, given the uncertainties of war. "I kept it, you know," Beaumont said finally. "The note you left with the pastries, warning me about the museum network. I shouldn't have. It was a security risk, but I did." Elise smiled at the confession. "I kept something too, the handkerchief from your coat pocket. It seemed important somehow. A reminder that even in the worst of times, kindness exists." Beaumont reached into his pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. "For you," he said, offering it to her, "a parting gift." Inside was a slim volume of poetry by Paul Eluard, the same book she had picked up and reluctantly returned to the shelf in that Paris bookshop months ago. "How did you find this?" she asked, running her fingers over the forbidden pages. "Switzerland has its advantages," Beaumont replied with a smile, freedom of the press being one of them. He left the next morning before dawn, departing for London and whatever new assignment awaited him there. Elise watched from her window as his car disappeared down the quiet street, the volume of poetry clutched in her hands. War continued to rage across Europe for more than 2 years after their escape from France. Elise worked with Allied intelligence, her intimate knowledge of German operations proving invaluable as the tide of the conflict slowly turned. Beaumont returned to France after the Normandy landings, helping to secure artworks and cultural treasures as the Germans retreated eastward. They did not see each other again until May of 1945, when victory in Europe had finally been declared. Beaumont, now a major, had been assigned to help catalogue recovered artwork in Paris. On a warm spring evening, he found himself walking along the Seine, retracing the path he had taken on that fateful December night in 1942. As he approached the Pont de l'Archevêché, he saw a familiar figure standing at the spot where they had first met. Elise, now dressed in the uniform of the Free French Forces, turned at the sound of his footsteps. "I thought you might come here," she said by way of greeting, "now that it's over." Beaumont smiled as he joined her at the railing, looking out over the river that had witnessed so much of their city's suffering and survival. "Some circles need to be closed properly." "I never thanked you," Elise said after a moment, "for the coat, for everything that followed." "As I recall, Ave," Beaumont replied, "you warned me about the museum network. I'd say that more than evens the score." They stood side by side as the evening light turned golden across the waters of the Seine. Paris was scarred but standing, beginning the long process of healing after years of occupation. "What will you do now?" Beaumont asked, genuinely curious about what peace might hold for a woman who had lived so long in the shadows. Elise considered the question. "I've been offered a position with the new International Commission on Art Restitution. My knowledge of what was taken, and from whom, apparently makes me valuable in peacetime as well as war." "A fitting use of your talents," Beaumont observed, "returning what was stolen rather than taking. And you?" "Back to academia, I think. Museums and lecture halls rather than safe house and borders." A comfortable silence fell between them, two people who had seen each other at their most vulnerable and their most courageous, who had entrusted each other with their lives despite every reason for suspicion. "I still have your handkerchief," Elise admitted with a small smile, "and the book of poetry." "I still have your warning note," Beaumont countered. "Some souvenirs of war are worth keeping." As the sun began to set over Paris, a Paris slowly reawakening to freedom, Robert Beaumont once again removed his coat and placed it gently around Elise Durand's shoulders. This time there were no secrets between them, no hidden motives, no war pressing in from all sides, just two people who had found humanity in each other when the world seemed determined to strip it away. "Shall we walk?" Beaumont suggested, offering his arm. "Paris is beautiful in the spring." And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.